When people talk about the Second World War, they usually talk about the big things. But for most of the people who lived through it, the war was not big at all. It was very, very small. It was the size of a weekly butter ration. It was the weight of a mended coat worn one more season. It was the sound of a radio in the evening, the only window onto a world that had grown strange and far away. Daily life during the war changed slowly, thoroughly, and in almost every direction. What people ate changed, what they wore changed. How they got to work, how they spent their evenings, what their children did at school, what time the clocks showed, all of it shifted. Not because of any single dramatic moment, but through a long, steady accumulation of new rules, new shortages, and new ways of getting by. There were recipes made from ingredients no one would have chosen. Clothes sewn from fabric no one would have picked. Letters written with care, because a stranger would read them first. Gardens dug in places no one had ever thought to plant. And through all of it, the ordinary rhythm of life, cooking, cleaning, working, resting, carried on, changed in shape but never fully interrupted. Over the next couple of hours, 101 quiet pieces of that story will come, one after another, gently and without hurry. There is nothing to memorize, nothing to keep up with. Just let the words settle at whatever pace feels comfortable, the way a familiar voice sounds in a quiet room late in the evening. Here is the first. Fact number 1. In many countries during the Second World War, ration books and coupons were used to limit how much food and household goods each person could buy. Governments printed small booklets, usually no bigger than a passport, and filled them with pages of perforated coupons. Each coupon stood for a fixed quantity of a specific item. A few ounces of sugar, a portion of butter, a measure of meat. When a person went to the shop, they could not simply pay with money alone. They had to tear out the correct coupon and hand it over along with their coins. Without the right coupon, the shopkeeper would not make the sale, no matter how much cash was on the counter. These little books lived in kitchen drawers, in handbags, in the inside pockets of coats, and they were guarded carefully. Losing a ration book was a genuine household emergency, because replacing one meant paperwork, waiting, and days without access to controlled goods. Over time, the ration book became one of the most handled, most creased, and most important objects in any home. It sat at the center of daily life, quietly deciding what a family could eat, wear, and use from one week to the next. Fact number 2. In Britain, weekly food allowances often covered basics like meat, fats, and sugar, and this changed the way people cooked from the ground up. A typical adult's weekly ration might include about 2 ounces of butter, 2 ounces of tea, 8 ounces of sugar, a modest portion of meat worth about 1 shilling and 6pence, and small amounts of cheese and margarine. These are tiny amounts by today's standards. The butter, for instance, was roughly the size of a small matchbox, and it had to last the entire week. A cook could not afford to be careless with a single spoonful. Meals were planned days in advance, with each ingredient assigned a purpose. Sunday's roast, if there was one, would be small, and the drippings saved carefully to use as cooking fat on Monday and Tuesday. Stale bread was never thrown away. It became bread pudding, or was dried and ground into crumbs for stretching other dishes. The weekly ration turned every kitchen into a place of quiet calculation, where meals were built not around what sounded appealing, but around what was available, measured out ounce by careful ounce. Cooking during rationing was less about inspiration and more about arithmetic. Fact number 3. Rationing was not only about food. Items like clothing, shoes, and sometimes even furniture were controlled in several countries during the war. In Britain, a clothing coupon system was introduced in 1941, which meant that buying a new pair of shoes or a winter coat required handing over coupons as well as money. A man's overcoat, for example, might cost 16 coupons from an annual allowance of roughly 60. that single purchase could eat up more than a quarter of the year's clothing budget in one go, which meant doing without other items, a new shirt, a pair of socks, for months afterward. Shoes were particularly precious, since they wore out faster than last garments and cost a significant number of coupons to replace. In some countries, furniture was also rationed. In Britain, only people who could prove a genuine need, newlyweds setting up a home, or families who had lost belongings, were allowed to buy from the limited range of approved designs. The reach of rationing into wardrobes, shoe racks, and living rooms meant that almost no part of domestic life was untouched. Even sitting on a new chair required the right paperwork and the right circumstances. Fact number 4. People learned to make do and mend, repairing and reusing clothing instead of replacing it. This phrase, widely promoted by the British government through leaflets, posters, and radio broadcasts, became a kind of national household motto. A jacket with a worn elbow did not get thrown away. It received a patch, often cut from a different garment that had already served its purpose elsewhere. A child's outgrown dress could be carefully unpicked at the seams, and the fabric recut into something smaller for a younger brother or sister. Socks were darned again and again, sometimes until the original wool was barely visible beneath layers of careful stitching. Fact number 5. In the UK, utility clothing set limits on fabric and design to save materials while keeping clothes affordable. Introduced in 1941 as part of the broader austerity program, the utility scheme controlled exactly how garments could be made. There were rules about the number of buttons allowed on a jacket, the maximum width of a hem, the depth of a pleat, the length of a sock, and even the number of pockets on a coat. Clothing that met these specifications was stamped with a distinctive label, 2 overlapping letter C's beside the number 41, known as the CC41 mark. This mark became one of the most recognized symbols on the British High Street. Despite the tight rules, designers worked within the constraints and often produced surprisingly elegant results, with clean lines, neat collars, and a streamlined simplicity that had its own appeal. A utility dress might be made from a modest amount of fabric, but it could still look sharp and well proportioned. The scheme proved that good design did not necessarily require extravagance. Even fashion, it turned out, could be made to follow wartime rules without losing all of its character. Fact number 6. In the United States, limits on fabric and certain styles encouraged simpler clothing designs during the war years. In 1942, the War Production Board issued a set of regulations that restricted the use of wool, silk, and other materials in civilian garments. The rules affected specific details. The width of trouser legs was narrowed, cuffs on men's pants were eliminated, the number of pleats was reduced, and decorative elements like patch pockets, wide lapels, and fabric belts were limited or removed. Women's skirts became shorter and less full, saving yards of fabric across millions of garments. The result was a cleaner, more streamlined look that came to be associated with the period. Men's clothing of this era, sometimes referred to as the victory suit, had a slim, efficient silhouette, still presentable, but noticeably pared back compared to pre-war fashion. Women's clothing followed a similar direction, with simpler cuts and less ornamentation. American fashion adapted to these constraints with a kind of practical elegance, proving that restrictions on material did not have to mean a loss of style. The wartime silhouette became a recognizable look of the era, shaped as much by government rules as by any designer's vision. Fact number 7. Many households planted victory gardens to grow vegetables and reduce pressure on national food supplies. The idea was simple and direct. If families could grow even a portion of their own food, it would ease the burden on commercial farms and shipping networks that were already stretched thin. Backyards, vacant lots, apartment rooftops, schoolyards, church grounds, and even window boxes were pressed into service. Tomatoes, green beans, lettuce, carrots, peas, and potatoes were among the most popular crops. In the United States, an estimated 20 million victory gardens were cultivated during the war years, and together they produced a remarkable share of the nation's fresh vegetables. In Britain, the campaign ran under the slogan, "Dig for Victory," and similar programs appeared in Canada, Australia, and other countries. For many families, tending the garden became a regular evening and weekend activity. Weeding, watering, checking for pests, and watching things grow. Cooling a ripe tomato from a vine that had been planted in soil where grass once grew felt like a small but genuine accomplishment. Across millions of homes, those small accomplishments quietly added up into something that made a real difference. Fact number 8. Home canning and preserving became a common seasonal routine for families trying to stretch their food supplies through the year. When the garden produced more than could be eaten fresh, or when seasonal fruit appeared briefly at the market, kitchens turned into small-scale preservation workshops. Glass jars were sterilized, filled with green beans, tomatoes, peaches, or pickled vegetables, sealed with rubber rings and metal lids, and then processed in boiling water to make them safe for long storage. The filled jars were labeled, dated, and lined up in neat rows on cellar shelves or in the back of a pantry cupboard. A productive Saturday afternoon might yield a dozen jars of something that would still be good to eat in January or February. Community groups and extension services held workshops to teach canning techniques to newcomers, and printed instructions circulated widely. The process was hot, sticky, time-consuming work. Standing over boiling pots in a summer kitchen was no one's idea of leisure. But the sight of those rows of glass jars, each one holding something grown and preserved by hand, represented a real and visible form of security. It was food in the bank, set aside against the leaner, colder months when the garden would be bare. Fact number 9. Shortages encouraged the use of substitute ingredients, and what those substitutes looked like depended on the country and the particular shortage. In Britain, powdered eggs became a familiar kitchen staple, arriving in small tins and reconstituted with water for use in cakes, scrambled eggs, omelettes, and baking. The results were edible, but never quite convincing. The texture was slightly off, the color a bit pale, and the taste carried a faintly metallic note that real eggs did not have. Across continental Europe and in parts of the United States, coffee substitutes appeared on breakfast tables, brewed from roasted barley, chicory root, rye, or even ground acorns. Fact number 10. Newspapers and radio regularly shared official recipes designed for rationed ingredients, and these shaped what families ate week after week. In Britain, the Ministry of Food published a steady stream of recipes that showed home cooks how to make nourishing meals from very little. There was Walton pie, named after the Minister of Food himself, a filling of diced root vegetables baked under a crust of potato or pastry. There was carrot fudge, which relied on the natural sweetness of carrots to compensate for limited sugar. There were mock dishes of every kind: mock cream, mock goose, mock banana, each one attempting to recreate something familiar from whatever happened to be available. Radio programs featured cooking segments, where cheerful presenters walked listeners through the steps of making a meal with rationed quantities. In the United States, newspapers ran similar columns with practical recipes and household tips. These recipes were not gourmet. They were functional, sometimes bland, and occasionally a bit optimistic about what carrots could achieve. But they were designed to be nutritious and honest about the limits people faced. The wartime recipe became a quiet little genre of its own, equal parts cooking instruction, government advice, and gentle encouragement to make the best of things. Fact number 11. Queuing, standing in long lines, became a completely normal part of shopping in places dealing with shortages. A line outside a shop was a signal that something desirable had arrived, and it was not unusual for people to join the back of a queue without even knowing what was being sold. It might be fish, it might be oranges, it might be offal, or a delivery of biscuits, or a shipment of onions. Whatever it was, if there was a queue, it was probably worth waiting for. Half an hour in line for a few items was ordinary. In some cities, an hour was not unusual. In Britain especially, the queue became almost a social institution, with its own unwritten code. No cutting, no saving places for friends who had not yet arrived, and quiet patience expected from everyone. News and gossip were exchanged. Complaints about the wait were kept mild and mostly good-humored. Shopping, which had once been a quick task squeezed between other errands, now required planning, sturdy shoes, and a willingness to stand in rain, wind, or cold for an uncertain reward. The long, orderly line of people outside a greengrocer or butcher became one of the most recognizable, everyday images of life during the war. Fact number 12. Black markets grew in many regions as people tried to get scarce goods outside the official rationing system. Wherever the official system created a gap between what people needed and what they could legally purchase, someone found a way to fill that gap for a price. A farmer in the countryside might sell eggs or butter directly to a neighbor at rates well above the controlled price. In cities, informal networks traded in sugar, meat, tobacco, stockings, petrol, and other hard-to-find items. The transactions might happen quietly at the back door of a shop, through a friend of a friend, or in a pub where certain people were known to have access to certain things. Governments tried to crack down through inspections, fines, and public campaigns, reminding people that buying from the black market was both illegal and unfair to those who followed the rules. Enforcement varied, and the black market was never fully eliminated. For most ordinary families, it occupied a moral gray area, something officially disapproved of, frequently discussed in disapproving tones, and yet sometimes resorted to when a child needed shoes and the shops had none, or when a special occasion called for something the coupons simply could not provide. The black market ran quietly alongside the official economy, and almost everyone knew someone who had used it at least once. Fact number 13. Salvage drives collected scrap metal, paper, rubber, and cooking fats from households for reuse in wartime production. Governments organized regular campaigns asking families to contribute whatever they could spare: old saucepans, broken tools, bent nails, stacks of newspapers, worn-out tires, and empty tin cans. How? In some British towns, iron railings were removed from parks and the front gardens of homes. Aluminium pots and pans were collected, with the promise that the metal might end up as part of an aircraft. Used cooking fat was saved and brought to collection points because it contained glycerin, a substance used in various manufacturing processes. Neighborhood collection bins appeared on street corners, and trucks made regular rounds to pick up what had been gathered. Posters encouraged participation, with simple messages about the value of materials that might otherwise have been thrown away. The idea that a dented old saucepan sitting uselessly in a kitchen cupboard might eventually become part of something important gave even the smallest contribution a feeling of purpose. Salvage drives turned the act of clearing out the house into something that felt connected to a much greater effort, linking the ordinary clutter of domestic life to the industrial needs of a nation at war. Fact number 14. Children often joined collection campaigns, turning everyday errands into small missions for the war effort. Schools organized paper drives, tin can collections, and competitions to see which class or grade could gather the most material. A walk to school became an opportunity to scout for discarded metal, bundles of old magazines, or other useful scrap. In the United States, some children collected milkweed pods during autumn. The silky fibers inside were used as stuffing for military life jackets because they were lightweight, water-resistant, and naturally buoyant. Boy Scout and Girl Guide troops ran their own organized drives, with totals tracked and celebrated. Fact number 15. Governments promoted careful household budgeting because prices and availability could change quickly during the war years. Official pamphlets, newspaper columns, and radio programs offered practical advice on how to plan weekly spending, avoid waste, and make the best use of both money and rations. A household manager, often the wife or mother, had to keep a running mental tally of coupon balances, compare prices at different shops, weigh one purchase against another, and adjust plans on the fly when something expected was not available. A sudden shortage could throw off an entire week's meal plan. A price increase on one item might mean cutting back on something else. The discipline of wartime budgeting went well beyond tracking money. It was also about managing time, ingredients, fuel, and effort, all of which were limited. A well-run wartime household required a kind of constant, low-level planning that started first thing in the morning and did not really stop until the last meal of the day was cleared away. It was not dramatic or exciting work. It rarely made anyone feel heroic, but it was essential, and those who did it well kept their families fed, clothed, and reasonably comfortable through years of scarcity. Fact number 16. In many places, fuel was rationed, which reduced leisure driving and changed the way people commuted to work and moved through their daily lives. In the United States, gasoline rationing was introduced in 1942, and most private drivers received a basic A sticker for their windshield, entitling them to just a few gallons per week, enough for essential trips, but little more. In Britain, the situation was even tighter. The basic petrol ration for private cars was eventually suspended altogether for a period, meaning that unless a driver had a documented work-related need, the car stayed parked. Sunday drives, once a common family pleasure, simply stopped. Weekend trips to the countryside or the coast became memories. People walked more. They planned their routes carefully. They thought twice, and sometimes 3 times, before making any journey that was not strictly necessary. A family car sitting in the garage with a dusty bonnet and slowly deflating tires became a quiet, familiar symbol of peacetime habits, but had been put on hold. The open road, once taken for granted, was now something that required justification and paperwork. Fact number 17. Carpooling and public transport use increased as gasoline became harder to get during the war. In the United States, government posters urged drivers to share rides with neighbors and co-workers. One well-known poster showed a man driving alone with the outline of a figure beside him, implying that an empty car seat was a wasted resource. Carpooling arrangements sprang up informally in neighborhoods and more formally at factory gates, where workers heading in the same direction grouped. Buses and trams saw ridership climb sharply, as people who might previously have driven their own cars now depended on public systems. Trains were frequently packed beyond any normal capacity, carrying both civilian commuters and military personnel headed to bases and ports. A compartment designed for 6 might hold 10 or 12, with passengers standing in the corridors and sitting on suitcases. The commute, which for many had once been a quiet, solitary drive, became a shared experience. Neighbors squeezed into a single vehicle, strangers standing hip to hip on a crowded bus. Getting to work lost its privacy, but gained, in its own uncomfortable way, a sense of shared purpose and reluctant companionship. Fact number 18. Wartime clock changes were used in some countries to save energy by shifting daylight hours. In the United States, year-round daylight saving time was introduced in February 1942, and it was sometimes printed on schedules and clocks as wartime to distinguish it from the peacetime standard. Britain went even further during the summer months, adopting what was called double British summertime. Clocks pushed a full 2 hours ahead of Greenwich Mean Time, making the evenings remarkably long and the mornings correspondingly dark. The reasoning was practical. By pushing the clocks forward, governments could squeeze more usable daylight out of each day, which meant less electricity was needed for lighting in homes, offices, and factories during the evening hours. For workers on early shifts, it sometimes meant leaving the house and walking or cycling to work in complete darkness. But the long, bright evenings allowed gardens to be tended after supper, children to play outside later, and factories to run with less artificial light. The clock change was a small adjustment in one sense, just an hour or two, but it touched every person's daily rhythm. Even the time on the kitchen wall, it turned out, could be rearranged to serve the needs of the war. Fact number 19. City blackouts reduced outdoor lighting at night to make aerial attacks more difficult, and this changed nightlife, routines, and the very feel of urban living in ways both large and small. Fact number 20. Blackout curtains and covered windows became standard household items in places on the air raid rolls, and putting them up each evening became one of the defining small rituals of wartime domestic life. Every window in the house, front rooms, bedrooms, kitchens, hallways, bathrooms, had to be covered with heavy dark fabric, thick cardboard, or specially fitted panels so that absolutely no light could escape to the outside. In Britain, fitting blackout curtains was one of the very first things many families did when the war began, even before rationing had started. The material had to be dense enough to block every trace of glow from an interior lamp. A single sliver of light showing through a gap in the curtains could bring a sharp knock on the door from a neighborhood warden and a firm reminder to close it up. Some people used 2 layers of dark cloth. Others nailed up boards or painted the window glass black. Checking the blackout each evening became as automatic as locking the front door, a habitual part of the transition from day to night. Drawing the curtains shut, checking every edge for gaps, and then switching on the lamp only when satisfied that no light could leak. This was the nightly routine in millions of homes. It was a small task, taking only a few minutes, but it was a nightly reminder that the world outside the window had changed. Fact number 21. Air raid drills trained people on what to do if sirens sounded, and over time, this kind of preparedness became a completely ordinary part of daily life. In cities and towns that faced the risk of aerial attack, regular drills taught people how to reach the nearest shelter quickly, how to help children and elderly neighbors get there safely, and what supplies to keep ready: a torch, identity papers, a blanket, perhaps a flask of water. The sound of the air raid siren, with its distinctive rising and falling wail, became one of the most familiar sounds in wartime urban life. Most people quickly learned to tell the difference between the wavering warning signal and the long, steady tone that meant the danger had passed and it was safe to come out. Workplaces held their own drills. Schools practiced regularly. Apartment buildings and public venues had designated procedures posted on walls and notice boards. In the early days, the drills caused genuine anxiety and sometimes confusion. But as months passed and the routines became familiar, most people moved through them calmly and efficiently, the way a fire drill works in a modern school or office. Preparedness was simply woven into the fabric of the week. Another thing to know and do, alongside shopping, cooking, and commuting. Fact number 22. In Britain, many people kept gas masks at home, and sometimes carried them in public, particularly during the early months of the war. Before fighting even began, the government had distributed tens of millions of gas masks to the civilian population, driven by the fear that aerial attacks might include poison gas, as had been used in the First World War. Adults received standard-issue masks, boxy, rubberized things with round glass eyepieces and a filter canister at the front, Children were given smaller versions, sometimes in brighter colors to make them seem less frightening. Babies had special enclosed helmets that a parent would pump by hand to push filtered air inside. People were told to carry their masks with them whenever they left the house, and most did so in the early months, slinging the square cardboard carrying box over one shoulder on a length of string. The gas mask box became a common sight on buses, in shops, at churches, and in school playgrounds. Some people decorated their boxes with fabric covers or painted them. As the months passed without any chemical attacks, the habit of carrying the mask gradually faded. The boxes were left by the front door, then moved to a shelf, then eventually tucked into a cupboard. But for a while, the gas mask box was as routine an accessory as an umbrella on a cloudy morning. Fact number 23. In London and other cities, some people used underground stations or public shelters during air raids, turning these spaces into a nightly routine for thousands of families. When sustained bombing began in the autumn of 1940, many Londoners started heading to tube stations in the early evening, well before any siren sounded. They brought blankets, pillows, flasks of tea, sandwiches wrapped in paper, and sometimes books or knitting to pass the time. Families staked out spots on the platforms, spreading their bedding along the curved walls and settling in for the night. The conditions were far from comfortable. The air was stale and warm. The concrete floors were hard. The noise of trains running their final services rumbled through the tunnels, and sanitation arrangements were basic at best. Yet a sense of community often developed among the regulars. People recognized one another. Conversations became familiar. Someone might share a biscuit or keep an eye on a neighbor's sleeping child. Other cities had their own shelters, basements of public buildings, reinforced school halls, church crypts. For many families, the evening routine came to include gathering a few essentials into a bag, walking to the shelter, settling in, and then returning home in the morning to see whether everything was still standing. It was an extraordinary routine that somehow became ordinary through sheer repetition. Fact number 24. Home shelters, like the Anderson shelter in the UK, were installed in back gardens and yards to give families a measure of protection without leaving the house. The Anderson shelter, named after the government minister who oversaw its introduction, was a simple structure made from curved corrugated steel panels. It was designed to be sunk into a rectangular pit dug in the garden, with the steel arch forming a roof above ground level, and the whole thing then covered with a thick layer of earth and turf. Inside, there was just enough room for a small family to sit on narrow bench-like bunks or lie down if they squeezed together. The government distributed millions of these shelters, often free of charge to lower-income households. Fact number 25. Civil defense volunteers helped with firefighting, first aid, and emergency response in their communities, often after putting in a full day at their regular jobs. Across many countries, ordinary people were trained as air raid wardens, fire watchers, auxiliary firefighters, first aiders, and rescue workers. A shopkeeper might spend the evening on the roof of a tall building, scanning the sky and watching for the glow of incendiary bombs. A schoolteacher might volunteer at the local first aid post on Saturday nights. A retired bus driver might join a rescue squad, trained to search damaged buildings. These were not paid positions. They were filled by people who already had families to care for, meals to cook, and jobs to show up for the next morning. The training was practical and hands-on. How to operate a stirrup pump to put out a small fire, how to apply a tourniquet, and how to move someone safely from a damaged structure. Civil defense was one of the clearest examples of how the boundary between military and civilian life blurred during the war. Ordinary people, in their own neighborhoods, took on responsibilities that would have seemed extraordinary in peacetime. And they did so week after week, year after year, alongside everything else their lives demanded. Fact number 26. Many communities organized neighborhood wardens to enforce blackout rules and guide people during alerts. and these wardens became one of the most familiar, everyday figures of wartime life. Air raid wardens were typically volunteers who lived on the same streets they patrolled. Their duties included walking the neighborhood during blackout hours, checking that no light was visible from any window, knocking on doors where a gap in the curtains was letting a glow escape, and directing people to the nearest shelter when sirens sounded. They wore distinctive helmets, usually marked with a W, and carried whistles and torches. After a raid, wardens helped assess damage, reported fires, and checked on neighbors who might need assistance. Because they were local people, the retired postman from the end of the road, the woman who ran the corner newsagent, the mechanic from the garage around the corner, the warden was both an authority figure and a neighbor. They might deliver a stern reminder about the blackout rules in one breath, and then ask after someone's children in the next. The role required patience, firmness, and a willingness to be out in all weather at all hours. It was community service in the most literal sense, carried out by people who knew the names behind every front door. Fact number 27. Schools adjusted their schedules and routines during the war, sometimes practicing drills and moving classes to protected areas Mulek sounded. In cities at risk of bombing, school buildings were assessed for their ability to withstand blast damage, and the safest areas, usually basements, ground floor corridors, or reinforced rooms, were designated as shelter spaces. When the siren sounded during the school day, lessons stopped, and children filed out of their classrooms in orderly lines, carrying their gas masks and coats, and moved to the protected area. Some schools operated on split schedules, with one group of children attending in the morning and another in the afternoon, to reduce overcrowding in the shelters and allow more space per child. Teachers adapted to these interruptions with patience and practicality, sometimes continuing the lesson in the shelter or reading aloud to keep the children calm and occupied. A drill might last 20 minutes or an hour, depending on how long the alert continued. For a generation of school children, the occasional interruption of a geography or arithmetic lesson by the sound of a siren was simply part of the rhythm of the school day, unusual by any peacetime standard, but perfectly normal in the world they were growing up in. Fact number 28. In Britain, large child evacuation programs moved many children from cities to rural areas for safety, in what became one of the most emotionally charged domestic events of the war. The government organized several waves of evacuation, the largest beginning on the 1st of September 1939, just days before war was declared. Hundreds of thousands of children were transported by train and bus from London and other major cities to smaller towns and villages in the countryside. They gathered at their schools in the early morning, labels tied to their coats with their names and school details, small suitcases or bundles in one hand, and gas mask boxes over one shoulder. At the other end, they were met by local organizers and matched with host families, sometimes by a process that felt bewildering and deeply impersonal. Children standing in a village hall, while local adults chose who to take. The scale of the operation was enormous. In the first few days alone, more than 1 million people were moved, mostly children, but also some mothers with very young infants and pregnant women. For many parents, the decision to send a child away was among the most painful they faced during the entire war, a choice between keeping the family together and keeping the child safe. Fact number 29. Evacuation meant that children often lived with host families, adapting to new rules, new food, and local customs that could feel profoundly unfamiliar. A child from a cramped flat in an industrial part of London might find herself on a dairy farm in Devon or a cottage in rural Wales, surrounded by open fields, animals, and accents she could barely understand. Meals were different, country food in larger portions than city rations, but sometimes strange to a child used to fish and chips and bread with dripping. Bedtimes were different, daily routines were different. The smells, the sounds, The darkness of a countryside night without streetlights. Everything was new. Some host families were genuinely warm and welcoming, treating the evacuee as one of their own children. Others were indifferent or unkind, viewing the arrangement as a burden. Fact number 30. Letter writing became a major daily habit during the war because so many families were separated by military service, war work, or evacuation. And a letter was often the only way to stay in touch. A wife might write to a husband stationed far away. A mother might write to a child living with strangers in the countryside. A young soldier might write home to his parents from a place he was not allowed to name. People wrote at kitchen tables after the dishes were cleared, on factory benches during tea breaks, on buses and trains during the commute, and by the dim light of a bedside lamp late at night when the house was finally quiet. The arrival of a letter, recognizing the handwriting on the envelope, tearing it open, unfolding the page, could brighten an entire week. Its absence, when days passed without word, could bring a quiet, nagging worry that was hard to shake. What to write was its own small art. The tone had to be cheerful enough to encourage, ordinary enough to comfort, and careful enough to pass the eyes of a censor. The content tended toward the domestic and the small. The garden is coming along. The baby smiled today. Mrs. Collins from down the road sends her regards. These millions of letters, crossing oceans and continents, were the fragile threads that held separated families together. Fact number 31. Mail was censored in many countries during the war, and people learned to write in careful, ordinary language that would pass official inspection without losing its personal meaning. Military and government censors read letters to and from service members, looking for any information that might be useful to the enemy. Place names, unit numbers, descriptions of equipment, details about movements or conditions. Anything considered sensitive was blacked out with ink or cut from the page with a blade, leaving rectangular holes in the paper. Knowing that a stranger would read every word before the letter reached its intended reader changed the way people expressed themselves. They kept to safe domestic subjects: the weather, the children's health, a funny story about the cat, the progress of the tomatoes in the garden. Deeper feelings were hinted at rather than stated plainly. Some families developed private codes over time, where a mention of a particular flower or a reference to a fictional neighbor carried a meaning only they would understand. A husband might know that when his wife mentioned Aunt Dorothy's visit, she was actually referring to something else entirely. The censored wartime letter was a strange and tender thing, full of love and longing, written with one eye on the reader at home and another on the unknown official who would see it first. Fact number 32. The United States used a system called V-mail, which photographed letters onto microfilm to reduce the shipping space needed for military mail and speed up delivery across long distances. The process worked like this. A person wrote their letter on a specially designed V-mail form. A single sheet with the address printed on one side and writing space on the other. The completed forms were collected, and each one was photographed in miniature onto a roll of microfilm. These small, lightweight rolls were then shipped by air or sea to their destination country, where the miniature images were printed back onto paper and delivered as reduced-size letters, roughly the dimensions of a postcard. The advantage was enormous in terms of space and weight. A single mail sack that might have held a few hundred ordinary paper letters could, in microfilm form, carry the equivalent of tens of thousands of messages. This freed up precious cargo space on ships and aircraft for other supplies. The printed-out V-mail letters were small and sometimes a bit blurry, but they were legible, and they arrived faster than conventional mail in many cases. For families separated by an ocean, speed mattered as much as anything. V-mail was a quiet, clever piece of wartime logistics, a practical solution to the very human problem of keeping people connected across vast and dangerous distances. Fact number 33. Torcels and care packages became emotionally important during the war, serving as physical tokens of love and connection. though they were restricted by weight limits, shipping regulations, and the same shortages that affected everything else. Sending a parcel to a family member far away was not a simple matter of wrapping a box and posting it. There were rules about maximum weight, prohibited items, and packaging materials. What went inside had to be chosen carefully. It had to be useful, it had to travel well, and it had to fit within the rules. A typical wartime care package might contain a pair of hand-knitted socks, a bar of chocolate, a tin of sweets, a packet of cigarettes, a small cake wrapped in layers of paper, a recent photograph, or a well-chosen paperback book. The contents were modest by any standard, but the emotional weight of a parcel far exceeded its physical weight. Receiving one meant that someone far away had thought carefully about what to include, had wrapped each item with care, had stood in line at the post office, and had paid the postage from a budget that was already tight. For the person opening the package, in a barracks, a hospital, or a lonely room in an unfamiliar city, each item inside carried a message that no letter could quite match. It was a piece of home, folded, wrapped, and sent across the world. Fact number 34. Radios were central to home life during the war, bringing news, official announcements, music, comedy, and drama into living rooms and kitchens at a time when families needed all of those things more than ever. In an era before television was widespread, the radio was the single most important source of information and entertainment in most households. Families gathered around the set in the evening, the way a later generation would gather around a television screen. Chairs pulled close, voices lowered, attention focused. The evening news bulletin was a fixed point in the day, a moment when the household paused whatever it was doing to listen. Fact number 35. Governments used radio broadcasts to share instructions, warnings, and messages intended to maintain public morale and keep people informed about what was expected of them. Official programming delivered a steady flow of practical information. Announcements about changes to ration allowances, schedules for salvage collection, reminders about civil defense procedures, public health advice, and updates on new regulations. In Britain, the BBC became one of the most trusted voices in the country, its broadcasts reaching homes, shelters, canteens, and factory floors. People tuned in not only for news of the war, but for guidance on the small, practical details of getting through each week. Government officials sometimes spoke directly on the air, explaining new policies or asking for cooperation with a particular campaign. In the United States, official broadcasts served similar purposes, with added features like sponsored public service announcements woven into entertainment programming. Radio was, in a very real sense, the primary tool any government had for speaking to its entire population at once, in real time, in their own homes. The habit of tuning in to the official broadcast at a set time each day became one of the most widely shared routines of the era. Millions of separate households, millions of separate radios, all receiving the same words at the same moment. Fact number 36. Newsreels shown in cinemas helped shape what people thought they knew about the wider war, offering moving images of events most could only otherwise read about or hear described on the radio. Before the main feature at a movie theater, audiences sat through a short newsreel, a filmed report lasting a few minutes, covering recent events and narrated in a clear, measured, confident voice. The footage might show ships at sea, factories in production, farmers harvesting, or leaders meeting at conferences. The images were selected and edited carefully, and in most countries, the content was reviewed by government officials or military censors before it reached the screen. The newsreel was not exactly journalism in the modern sense. It was closer to a curated summary, designed to inform, but also to maintain confidence and morale. Still, for millions of ordinary people, the cinema newsreel was the closest thing available to actually seeing distant events with their own eyes. It made the war feel more real and more visual than any printed report or radio bulletin could manage. The experience of watching a newsreel in a darkened theater, surrounded by neighbors, was both communal and personal. Everyone in the room seeing the same images, but each person absorbing them through the lens of their own worries and hopes. Fact number 37. Film, music, and comedy remained important throughout the war, giving people a familiar routine and a few hours of relief during deeply uncertain times. Cinema stayed open in most countries, and attendance was remarkably high. In Britain, cinema admissions actually rose during the war years. A trip to the pictures, as it was often called, offered something that was in short supply everywhere else. A warm room, a comfortable seat, and a couple of hours with a story that had nothing whatsoever to do with ration books, blackout curtains, or salvage drives. Musicals, romantic comedies, detective stories, and adventure films drew steady crowds. On the radio, comedy programs and variety shows gave families something to laugh about at the end of a long and wearing day. Popular songs traveled from the dance hall to the radio to the kitchen, hummed and whistled as people went about their work. Music had a way of attaching itself to moments and becoming a shared language. A song heard on the radio might be the same one a wife had danced to before the war, and hearing it again carried a private meaning alongside the public one. Entertainment during the war was not a frivolity or an escape in the shallow sense. It was a thread of continuity, a small space where life still felt like itself, and people could sit in the dark, watch a story unfold, and forget, just for a little while, about everything waiting outside. Fact number 38. In the United States, the USO organized entertainment for service members, connecting civilian performers with wartime audiences and bringing a taste of home to people stationed far from it. Founded in 1941, the United Service Organizations brought together musicians, comedians, dancers, and other entertainers, and sent them to military bases, training camps, hospitals, and staging areas around the world. Shows were held on whatever stage was available: a mess hall cleared of tables, an aircraft hangar with chairs set up in rows, a wooden platform built in an open field, the back of a flatbed truck parked in a clearing. A typical USO show might feature a swing band, a stand-up comedy routine, a group of singers, or a well-known actor telling stories and chatting with the audience. The audiences sat on crates, on folding chairs, on the ground, or stood at the back craning their necks. For the performers, it was a chance to contribute something personal to the effort. For the people watching, it was something rarer and more valuable. A few hours that felt normal, that felt like the world they had left behind. The laughter, the music, the familiar rhythms of a comedy sketch. These things carried a weight that went far beyond entertainment. Fact number 39. Dance halls and social clubs continued to operate in many places during the war, though often under blackout lighting rules and travel restrictions that shape the experience in new ways. Dancing remained one of the most popular forms of evening entertainment, and on weekends especially, halls were packed. Swing music, big band numbers, and popular tunes of the day filled the rooms, and couples moved across crowded floors under lights dimmed to meet blackout-adjacent regulations. The atmosphere was warm and close, bodies in motion, music in the air, and for a few hours, the worries of the week pushed to the edges of the room. Getting to the dance hall and back home again, however, could be an adventure of its own. Limited public transport, fuel restrictions, and dark streets went planning ahead, and sometimes walking considerable distances in complete blackout. A wrong turn on the way home could mean wandering unfamiliar streets in the dark. Despite these complications, the call of music and company was powerful enough to keep people coming. Fact number 40. Sports continued during the war, though with adjustments that reflected the shortage of players, equipment, staff, and the ability to travel. In many countries, large numbers of professional athletes enlisted or were called up for military service, leaving teams with smaller rosters and less experienced players. Some leagues suspended operations entirely. Others carried on with reduced schedules, shorter seasons, and restrictions on how far teams could travel for away matches. to save fuel and keep transport available for more essential purposes. Equipment was harder to replace. A burst football, a cracked cricket bat, or a torn pair of boxing gloves could not always be repaired or replaced when the factories that once made sporting goods were now producing military equipment. Despite all of this, matches went ahead and people still came to watch. A local football game on a Saturday afternoon, even one played by a patched-together team with borrowed boots, offered something that wartime could not ration: a sense of community, a bit of excitement, and the comforting familiarity of a game that followed the same rules it always had, even if everything else had changed. Fact number 41. Paper shortages affected publishing during the war, reducing the size of magazines and limiting how many books could be printed in many countries. Paper, like so many other raw materials, was needed for military and government purposes. Maps, instruction manuals, training materials, identity documents, forms, and packaging all demanded paper in large quantities. Civilian publishers were allocated reduced supplies, and they had to make difficult decisions about what to print and how to print it. Books were set in smaller type on cheaper, rougher paper with narrower margins, squeezing more text onto each page to conserve stock. Libraries noticed a sharp increase in borrowing, as readers who could not easily find or afford new books turned to shared collections instead. The wartime book, with its thin, slightly rough pages, its plain cover, and its faintly smudged ink, became a distinctive and recognizable object. It was handled with more care than most books before or since, because everyone understood that the next one might not be easy to come by. Fact number 42. Many everyday products used simpler packaging during the war, and some familiar brand options disappeared from shop shelves entirely as factories converted to wartime production. A company that had spent years building a recognizable identity through colorful tins, printed wrappers, and distinctive boxes might now be producing military rations, medical supplies, or ammunition components instead. The consumer products that did remain on shelves often came in plain wrappers with minimal printing, saving both ink and packaging materials. Labels were smaller, colors were fewer. The elaborate, eye-catching designs of the pre-war era gave way to simple text on brown or white paper. Some well-known brands vanished altogether, replaced by generic alternatives or government standard products. A few companies placed small notices in newspapers or on their remaining products, promising that their familiar brands would return once the war was over. In the meantime, shoppers adapted. They learned to identify products by shape and size, rather than by logo or color. The modest, undecorated package became the norm, and the brightly colored, heavily marketed pre-war product became a memory, something from a different era that everyone hoped would eventually come back. Fact number 43. Household appliances in consumer goods could be very difficult to buy during the war, because manufacturing capacity was directed toward military contracts and essential production. Factories that had once turned out washing machines, vacuum cleaners, electric irons, toasters, refrigerators, and radios were now building aircraft engines, vehicle parts, communications equipment, or ammunition. The production of new civilian appliances dropped to a trickle or stopped completely. If an iron broke down, there was no new one to buy. The factory that made it was now making something else entirely. The broken iron would be taken to a repair shop, if one was available, or fixed at home with improvised methods, or its function replaced by a heated flat piece of metal, or a pan filled with hot coals. A kettle that developed a leak might be patched with solder rather than thrown away. A vacuum cleaner that stopped working might sit in a closet for the duration of the war, waiting for parts that would not be available until factories returned to peacetime production. People developed a new relationship with their possessions, careful, patient, and conservative. The things in the house were treated less as replaceable conveniences and more as valuable tools that needed to last, because there was simply no alternative sitting on a shop shelf somewhere. Fact number 44. Repair shops became more important during the war than they had ever been, because replacing everyday items was so difficult that fixing them was the only practical option. Cobblers who mended shoes, tailors who could alter and repair garments, radio technicians who could diagnose and fix a crackly set, bicycle mechanics who could straighten a wheel or patch a tube, and general handymen who could fix a dripping tap or resolder a cooking pot. All of these found themselves busier than at any time in memory. A pair of shoes might visit the cobbler 3 or 4 times, getting new soles, new heels, and fresh stitching each time, before finally being declared beyond help. A winter coat might be relined, patched, and taken in or let out as the wearer's shape changed over the years. Fact number 45. In the United States, the War Production Board coordinated industrial priorities at a national level, and its decisions rippled outward to affect what ordinary people could find and buy in their local shops. Established in January 1942, the board was given authority to determine how raw materials, steel, aluminum, copper, rubber, and many others, would be allocated across the economy. Its job was to make sure that military and essential production got what it needed first, with civilian needs served from whatever was left over. If steel was needed for warships, then steel for new civilian automobiles was drastically curtailed. If rubber was needed for military tires and equipment, then rubber for household goods in personal vehicles virtually disappeared. If copper was reserved for shell casings and electrical wiring for military installations, then copper for domestic plumbing had to wait. The board's work took place in offices and committee rooms far from any family kitchen, but its effects were felt every time a person walked into a shop and found something they expected to buy was simply not available. The empty shelf, the apologetic shopkeeper, the not available for the duration sign. Behind all of these stood the quiet, powerful influence of industrial prioritization. Fact number 46. Factories across many countries were retooled to make wartime equipment. And this transformation changed the kinds of jobs that were available in towns and communities everywhere. An automobile plant that had spent decades building family cars might now be assembling aircraft engines or walking as much design. A sewing machine factory, a company known for typewriters, might now be stamping out ammunition casings or bomb components. A piano manufacturer might be shaping wooden parts for gliders. These conversions sometimes happened with remarkable speed. A factory might receive its orders one month and be producing entirely different products the next. The change was visible to everyone in the surrounding community. Workers who had spent years doing one kind of specialized job found themselves retrained for something completely different. A man who had assembled car doors might now be fixing engine cowlings. A woman who had operated a textile loom might be learning to read blueprints for artillery components. The factory itself still stood in the same place. Its lights still came on each morning. Its whistle still blew at shift change. But what happened inside had been fundamentally and sometimes unrecognizably altered by the demands of the war. Fact number 47. Women entered industrial work in enormous numbers during the war, becoming a highly visible and essential part of factory and shipyard labor across many countries. With millions of men serving in the armed forces, industries faced severe labor shortages at precisely the moment when production needed to increase. The solution was to recruit women for roles that had previously been filled almost exclusively by men. Women operated heavy lathes, welded steel plates, riveted aircraft panels and ship hulls, assembled engines, inspected finished products, drove forklifts and cranes, and managed production lines. In the United States, the image of Rosie the Riveter, a strong woman with rolled-up sleeves and a determined expression, became a widely recognized cultural symbol of women's contribution to the industrial war effort, though the reality was far more varied and complex than any single image could capture. In Britain, women were formally directed into essential war work through government orders. The shift was visible everywhere. Factory floors that had been almost entirely male spaces now included women in overalls, welding masks, and steel-toed boots. The change challenged assumptions that had been deeply embedded for generations, demonstrating on an enormous scale that women could perform physically demanding, technically skilled, and critically important industrial work. Fact number 48. New training programs were created to help people learn skilled industrial jobs quickly, including welding, machining, electrical work, and other trades that were urgently needed for wartime production. In peacetime, learning these skills might have involved a formal apprenticeship lasting a year or more. There is no time for that now. Compressed training courses, sometimes lasting only a few weeks, were set up in factory buildings, vocational schools, and community halls, running day and night to keep pace with demand. A person who had never touched a welding torch or stood in front of a lathe might complete training and be working on a production line within a month. The courses were practical and focused, less theory, more hands-on practice, and they were open to people from all kinds of backgrounds. Women who had worked in shops or offices found themselves learning to read technical drawings and operate precision machinery. Men from clerical or service jobs were trained in metalwork and assembly. For many participants, particularly those who had not previously had access to industrial skills, these crash courses were transformative. The abilities acquired in a few intense weeks opened the door to new kinds of work, new levels of confidence, and for some, entirely new career paths that continued long after the war was over. Fact number 49. Childcare became a serious and urgent issue for working families during the war, and some areas responded by expanding nurseries and organized support services, though the need almost always outpaced what was available. With both parents employed in essential work, or with a single parent working shifts in a factory, the practical question of who would look after young children during the day became impossible to ignore. Relatives helped when they could, and neighbors sometimes shared the responsibility, but these informal arrangements could not cover every family's needs. In the United States, the Lanham Act provided federal funding for child care centers located near major defense plants. Some of these centers were remarkably well run, offering not just supervision but structured activities, nutritious meals, and extended hours that matched the long and irregular shifts of factory work. Fact number 50. In several countries during the war, uniforms became common not only in the military but also in civilian services, volunteer organizations, and many everyday jobs, giving towns and cities a distinctly coordinated appearance. Bus conductors, air raid wardens, fire watchers, nurses, ambulance drivers, factory workers, members of women's auxiliary services, and volunteers in organizations like the Women's Voluntary Service all wore some form of distinctive clothing or insignia. A walk down a busy city street during the war years might reveal half a dozen or more different uniforms in the space of a single block, each one identifying a different role, a different organization, a different set of responsibilities. Uniforms served several practical purposes. They made it easy to identify who was responsible for what during an emergency. They provided some physical protection for people doing manual or outdoor work. And they helped conserve rationed personal clothing by replacing everyday garments with issued ones during working hours. But beyond a practical, uniforms had a visual and psychological effect on the character of daily life. They blurred the boundary between the military world and the civilian one, giving the impression, and to some extent the reality, but the entire society was organized, mobilized, and dressed for a common purpose. From the bus depot to the factory gate to the evening warden's patrol. Fact number 51. Identification papers and registration systems expanded in many places during the war, especially in occupied countries or regions operating under strict security rules, and carrying the right documents became a routine part of everyday life. In Britain, a national registration system was introduced in September 1939, just days after war was declared, and every person in the country was issued a small, buff-colored identity card, printed with their name, address, and national registration number. The card had to be produced on request to any police officer or authorized official. It was not a dramatic document. It looked something like a library card, but it represented a significant change in the relationship between the individual and the state. Before the war, Most British people had never carried any form of official identification in their daily lives. Now it was expected, and failing to produce it when asked, looked to a fine. You will make it for yourself. In occupied parts of Europe, the situation was far more extensive and far more consequential. Residents were required to carry detailed identity papers at all times and present them at checkpoints, during random inspections, and whenever entering or leaving certain areas. The papers recorded not just a name and address, but nationality, occupation, and other personal details. Having the correct documents, or not having them, could determine access to food, employment, and freedom of movement. Fact number 52. Curfews and travel restrictions affected evening routines and visits to family and friends in some regions, shrinking the world that people could move through and the hours they could move through it. In occupied territories across Europe, curfews were strict, and the penalties for breaking them could be severe. Being found on the street after the designated hour risked arrest, interrogation, or worse. Even in countries that were not occupied, travel became more limited and more difficult as the war continued. Fuel rationing meant that private cars were rarely an option for personal trips. Train and bus services were reduced, and the routes that remained were often crowded and unreliable. A visit to a relative in the next town, which before the war might have been an easy Sunday afternoon trip, could now require a special travel permit, or might simply not be possible because no suitable transport was running. Even socializing shrank. People stayed closer to home, visited neighbors rather than distant friends, and adjusted their expectations about how far they could go and how late they could stay. The simple, unremarkable freedom of deciding to visit someone whenever the mood struck, of walking out the door at any hour and going wherever one pleased, turned out to be one of those quiet, everyday liberties that most people had never thought much about, until wartime conditions steadily, quietly, and thoroughly took it away. Fact number 53. People learned to live with fewer imported goods during the war because shipping space was limited and the ocean routes that cargo traveled were dangerous. Before the war, many countries had relied on a steady flow of imported products: tropical fruits, coffee, tea, cocoa, spices, sugar, rubber, metals, hardwoods, and countless other goods arrived by ship from all over the world. That flow was now disrupted. Ships that once carried civilian cargo were requisitioned for military use or diverted to carry essential war materials. The threat of submarine attacks meant that every ocean crossing carried risk, and some ships never arrived at all, their cargo lost along with them. The result, for people at home, was a gradual disappearance of once familiar items from shop shelves and kitchen cupboards. In Britain, bananas essentially vanished for the entire duration of the war, and there were children who grew up during those years without ever seeing or tasting one. Oranges appeared so rarely that a single orange in a child's Christmas stocking was considered a genuine treat. Coffee, cocoa, and many spices became scarce or unobtainable. The kitchen shelf, the bathroom cabinet, and the workshop bench all shrank, as the range of available goods narrowed to what could be produced domestically or sourced from nearby countries, and people adapted to a smaller, simpler world of fewer choices and fewer flavors. Fact number 54. Shipping losses and convoy priorities influenced what foods and materials actually reached different countries, shaping daily life in ways that most people could never see or fully understand. Every cargo ship that crossed the Atlantic or sailed other dangerous routes carried a finite amount of space, and hard decisions had to be made about how to fill it. Military equipment, ammunition, fuel, and vehicles almost always took priority over civilian goods. A ship loaded with tanks and trucks had no room for crates of oranges or sacks of coffee. And not every ship that set out arrived safely. Losses to submarine attacks, mines and storms meant that some cargoes were lost entirely, taking their contents to the bottom of the ocean. These logistical realities, which played out in shipping offices, naval planning rooms, and convoy briefing, these majesty realities were trying to rise pursuit. Fact number 55. In Britain and elsewhere, Dig for Victory campaigns turned lawns, parks, flower beds, and all manner of public and private spaces into small food-producing plots. The slogan Dig for Victory was everywhere, on posters in shop windows, in newspaper advertisements, on the radio, and on leaflets pushed through letterboxes. The message was direct and practical. Every patch of ground that could grow food should grow food. Flower beds in public parks were dug up and replanted with rows of cabbages, carrots, and potatoes. The moat surrounding the Tower of London was used to grow vegetables. Grass verges along roads were converted into planting strips. Private lawns became vegetable patches. Window boxes that had held geraniums now held herbs and salad leaves. Allotments, small rented garden plots, were in enormous demand, and waiting lists at many sites stretched for months or even years. The campaign was effective. The total area of land under food cultivation in Britain increased significantly during the war, and a meaningful proportion of the country's vegetables were grown not on commercial farms, but in back gardens, school grounds, and public spaces by ordinary people with spades and seed packets. A retired teacher digging over a strip of lawn, or a group of neighbors sharing wheelbarrow and comparing the size of their cabbages, was not a dramatic sight. Fact number 56. Many governments used propaganda posters to encourage saving, recycling, careful speech, and steady work. And these posters became one of the most recognizable visual features of everyday wartime life. They appeared in shop windows, on factory walls, at bus stops, in post offices, on railway station platforms, in canteens, above pub bars, and on hoardings along the street. The designs ranged from bold and colorful to stark and severe. Some used humor, others relied on dramatic imagery or blunt slogans. A commuter waiting for a tram might look up and see a poster urging the collection of kitchen scraps. A factory worker heading to the canteen might pass one, reminding everyone that every rivet, every bolt, every weld mattered. A housewife at the post office might glance at one, encouraging her to save and salvage. The posters covered an enormous range of subjects: rationing, fuel conservation, careless talk, war bonds, civil defense, health and hygiene, blackout rules, and dozens of others. They were designed to be absorbed almost without effort, their simple images and short phrases sinking in through sheer repetition. Over time, they became part of the visual wallpaper of daily existence, so common that people stopped consciously noticing them individually, yet so persistent and so widespread that their collective message was nearly impossible to escape. Fact number 57. Slogans about secrecy were common during the war, warning people not to share sensitive information casually, and these warnings became a familiar background hum in everyday conversation and public spaces. Loose lips sink ships was one of the best known in the United States. Careless talk costs lives was its British equivalent. Other versions included, "The enemy is listening," "Be like dad," "Keep mum," and "Wars have ears." These phrases appeared on posters in pubs, railway carriages, factory notice boards, and telephone booths. They were repeated on the radio and referenced in newspaper editorials. The underlying message was always the same. Even seemingly harmless details about troop movements, ship departures, factory production, or new equipment could, if overheard by the wrong person, make their way to the enemy and put lives at risk. A casual remark in a pub about where a relative was stationed, or an offhand comment on a bus about what a local factory was producing, might seem innocent enough. But the campaigns insisted that carelessness could have serious consequences. Whether the actual risk of idle gossip was as great as the slogan suggested is a matter historians still discuss. But the cultural effect was real. The campaigns created a widespread habit of caution, a tendency to think before speaking in public, and a general awareness that in wartime, even ordinary conversation carried a weight it had not carried before. Fact number 58. Rumors spread easily during the war, and officials sometimes had to issue specific guidance to counter misinformation that was circulating through communities. In a world of limited news, delayed information, censored reports, and widespread anxiety, rumors rushed in to fill the gaps that facts left empty. A whispered story about an impending invasion, a secret weapon, a local disaster, or a dramatic change in rations could move through a neighborhood, a workplace, or a market queue in a matter of hours. Some rumors were harmless exaggerations, a slight shortage inflated into a full-blown crisis. Others were more troubling, causing genuine alarm or undermining trust in official information. Governments recognized the problem and occasionally addressed specific rumors head-on, using radio broadcasts, newspaper notices, or official statements to correct false stories and reassure the public. In some countries, spreading certain kinds of rumors was actually made a punishable offense, though enforcement was uneven and difficult. The wartime rumor mill was a natural and perhaps inevitable product of a society that was nervous, hungry for news, not always fully informed, and acutely aware that important things were happening beyond its sight. Managing what people believed turned out to be nearly as difficult as managing what they could buy, and the line between maintaining morale and telling the whole truth was one that officials had to walk carefully. Fact number 59. Wartime wages rose in some industries, particularly those connected to defense and essential production, but shortages meant that having more money in the pocket did not always mean being able to buy more things. A factory worker putting in long overtime shifts at a munitions plant or a shipyard might bring home a weekly pay packet larger than anything earned before the war. In many countries, the demand for labor pushed wages upward, and people in certain trades found themselves earning more than they ever had. But the shelves in the shops told a different story. The new coat, the piece of furniture, the good cut of meat, the box of chocolates. These things were either rationed, unavailable, or both, regardless of how much cash a person was willing to spend. Fact number 60. Day-to-day meals changed considerably as people replaced scarce items with seasonal or locally available foods, and the variety and flavor of what appeared on the plate shifted in ways that were impossible to ignore. Before the war, a family dinner might have included ingredients sourced from several different countries. Sugar from the Caribbean, tea from India, butter from Denmark, meat from Argentina. During the war, that global pantry shrank to whatever the local area, domestic supply chain, and the ration book could provide. Any side said, "My son has been terrible power." Root vegetables, potatoes, carrots, turnips, parsnips, Swedes appeared in meals far more often than they had before. Cabbage was a weekly constant. Bread, oatmeal, and porridge filled gaps. Fresh fruit became seasonal rather than year-round, and when it appeared, it was eaten quickly and gratefully. Meals were simpler, more repetitive, and built around what was actually at hand, rather than what anyone particularly wanted to eat. One day's dinner might look a lot like Wednesday's, and both might look remarkably similar to what had been served the previous week. The wartime table was not a place of culinary adventure. It was modest, practical, and sometimes monotonous, but it was nourishing, and the cooks who managed to produce 3 meals a day from limited and repetitive ingredients, week after week, month after month, deserved more credit than they usually received. Fact number 61. Restaurant menus and portions often shrank during the war, and some foods that had once been perfectly ordinary became special occasion treats. In Britain, the government set maximum prices for restaurant meals and limited the number of courses that could be served, typically to 3, with no more than one dish containing meat or fish. Menus became shorter and simpler, with fewer choices and smaller portions. A piece of cake made with real eggs and sugar, rather than substitutes, became a rare indulgence. A restaurant that could offer a real egg dish or a decent piece of fish might attract a longer queue than usual. In many countries, restaurants and cafes remained popular places to meet friends, share a meal, and get out of the house for a while. But the experience was leaner and quieter than it had been in peacetime. A cup of tea and a modest sandwich might represent the full extent of what was on offer. Dining out was still a social pleasure, still a break from the routine of cooking at home, but it was stripped of the abundance and variety that had once made a restaurant meal feel like an occasion. A good meal out was no longer something taken for granted. It was something noticed, appreciated, and sometimes talked about for days afterward. Fact number 62. Tea and coffee habits shifted depending on supply lines and national circumstances, with substitutes becoming part of the daily routine in many places. In Britain, tea held a special status. The government considered it essential for public morale and made sure that supplies, though rationed, kept arriving. The typical ration was about 2 ounces per person per week, which was enough for a few cups a day if the leaves were measured carefully and sometimes reused for a second, weaker pot. The ritual of making and drinking tea remained central to British daily life, a small warm anchor in days that were otherwise full of restriction and uncertainty. On the continent, and in parts of the Americas, the story was often about coffee rather than tea, and the disruption was more severe. Real coffee beans became scarce or unavailable in many countries, replaced by substitutes brewed from roasted barley, chicory root, rye, acorns, or various blended grains. These substitutes bore only a passing resemblance to real coffee. The color was approximately right, but the taste and aroma were, to put it politely, an acquired experience. Still, people drink them every morning, because the habit of a hot cup at the start of the day was one of those small comforts that people were reluctant to give up entirely, even when the contents of the cup had changed beyond recognition. Fact number 63. Soap shortages in some places made personal hygiene more difficult than usual, and governments run campaigns encouraging people to use soap carefully and avoid waste. Soap production requires fats and oils, and those raw materials were in heavy demand for other wartime uses, including the extraction of glycerin for manufacturing. In Britain, soap was added to the rationing system in 1942, with each person receiving a modest monthly allowance that covered all their washing needs: body, hands, hair, laundry, and dishes combined. The amount was enough to manage on, but it did not allow for any extravagance. A bar of soap was expected to last far longer than it would have before the war. Tips circulated on how to make it go further: storing it in a dry place between uses so it hardened and lasted longer, cutting it into smaller pieces for different purposes, using slivers rather than a full bar, and saving even the smallest scraps to be pressed together into a new piece. Leaflets advised on washing techniques that used less soap and still achieved reasonable cleanliness. The soap shortage was one of those quiet, intimate wartime inconveniences that rarely made the front page of any newspaper. Fact number 65. Repairs to homes and buildings were sometimes delayed during the war because building materials and skilled labor were prioritized for military construction and essential war-related needs. A leaking roof, a cracked window pane, a damp wall, or a broken drain pipe might have to wait months for proper attention because the timber, glass, nails, plaster, and plumbing supplies needed for the repair were being directed elsewhere. Skilled tradespeople, carpenters, plumbers, glaziers, bricklayers, electricians were in short supply, as many had joined the armed forces or been directed into essential construction work, building airfields, factories, barracks, and military installations. Homeowners did what they could with their own hands and whatever materials they could find. A broken window was covered with a piece of board or thick cardboard rather than replaced with glass. A damaged wall was patched with cement salvaged from another job. A leak was managed with buckets and rags until proper repair became possible. The slow accumulation of deferred maintenance, a dripping tap here, a sticking door there, a cracked gutter that nobody had time or material to fix, meant that many homes emerged from the war in a tired, patched-up, make-do condition. The backlog of repairs that had built up over 6 years would take considerable time, money and effort to work through in the years that followed. Fact number 66. In many areas, bicycles became even more important for daily commuting during the war, when fuel restrictions made motor vehicles impractical for most people's everyday travel. With gasoline rationed and private cars either parked in garages or requisitioned for essential use, the bicycle offered something that no other form of personal transport could match. It was affordable, it was available, and it ran on nothing but human effort. In countries like the Netherlands and Denmark, where cycling was already deeply woven into daily life, the bicycle became even more central than it had been before. In Britain and the United States, people who had not ridden in years pulled old machines out of garden sheds, pumped up flattened tires, oiled stiff chains, and took to the roads again. Cycling to work, to the shops, and to visit friends became routine for millions who might previously have driven or taken a bus. Spare parts were not always easy to find, particular tires and inner tubes, and a puncture or a snap chain could be a genuine inconvenience when replacements were scarce. The wartime bicycle was often battered, heavy, rusty in places, and held together with improvised repairs, a piece of wire standing in for a proper clip, a patch upon a patch on the inner tube. But it worked. It got people where they needed to go, day after day, with nothing more than pedal power and persistence. Fact number 67. Public transportation ran under heavy strain during the war, with crowded trains and buses becoming a daily reality for millions of commuters and travelers. More people than ever were relying on public transit at the same time that services were frequently reduced. Fuel shortages, vehicle maintenance backlogs, a lack of spare parts, and reduced staffing all affected the frequency and reliability of services. Trains carried both civilian commuters and military personnel, and carriages designed for a comfortable 8 passengers regularly held 12 or 15, with additional people standing in the corridors, sitting on suitcases, and leaning against compartment doors. Buses ran on irregular schedules, sometimes arriving late, sometimes not arriving at all, and were almost always full during peak hours. Standing room was a luxury on the busiest routes. During shift changes at large factories, the demand was especially intense, with hundreds of workers trying to board the same handful of vehicles. Despite the discomfort and the inconvenience, public transport kept towns and cities functioning. It carried people to work, to markets, to hospitals, and back home again. The crowded wartime bus, its windows steamed with the breath of too many passengers, its aisle packed with standing bodies swaying together at each turn, was one of the most common shared experiences of the home front, a daily exercise in patience, proximity, and quiet endurance. Fact number 68. Some cities introduced special rules for window lighting and car headlights to reduce visibility from the air at night, creating a patchwork of small, careful adjustments to the way light was used after dark. Full blackout was the rule in many areas, but the specific regulations varied from place to place and evolved over time. Vehicle headlights were typically fitted with covers or metal masks that allowed only a narrow slit of downward-pointing light to reach the road, just enough to see a few yards ahead, but not enough to be visible from any altitude. The effect was a dim, ghostly glow that made driving slow and hazardous. Shop windows were sometimes permitted a faint, carefully shielded interior light, just enough to suggest the shop was open, without broadcasting its presence into the sky. Street crossings and curbs were marked with dabs of white paint, so that pedestrians could find their footing in the darkness. Traffic lights, where they existed, were fitted with narrow hoods that directed their colored light downward in a tight beam. Even the interior lights of buses and trams were dimmed or fitted with blue filters. Each small regulation was a negotiation between two competing needs, keeping everyday life functional and safe on the ground, while maintaining invisibility from above. The city after dark became a place of narrow slits, dim glows, white dashes, and careful shadows, all managed through a web of quiet, practical rules. Fact number 69. Air raid sirens, drills, and alert systems created a shared soundscape during the war that people learned to read and interpret almost instinctively after months of living with it. The warning siren had a distinctive rising and falling wail that once heard was never forgotten. The all clear was a single steady, unwavering tone that signaled the end of the immediate threat. Between these two sounds, there might be the distant hum of aircraft engines, the thud of anti-aircraft fire, or simply a tense, expectant silence. Fact number 70. Community notice boards and local announcements became practical and important sources of day-to-day information during the war, serving as neighborhood hubs in an era long before digital communication. These boards were posted in shops, churches, libraries, town halls, post offices, and on lampposts or fences along well-traveled streets. They carried a constantly changing mix of notices: announcements about changes to ration allowances, dates for salvage collection, schedules for civil defense meetings, calls for volunteers, times and locations of community events, and practical warnings or reminders from local authorities. A quick stop at the notice board outside the post office or the grocer shop might reveal that the fishmonger expected a delivery on Friday, that the WWII was collecting warm clothing for evacuees, that a civil defense drill was planned for Thursday evening, or that a local hall was hosting a dance on Saturday night. The information was handwritten or typed, pinned to cork with thumbtacks, and updated as often as circumstances required. In a time when news traveled slowly, and official information sometimes took days to filter down to the local level, the community notice board was a remarkably effective and simple system. It required nothing more than a flat surface, some paper, and a few pins. Yet it kept neighborhoods informed about the small practical details that shaped each week. People checked these boards regularly and habitually. Fact number 71. Wartime shortages shaped beauty and grooming habits in ways that ranged from the practical to the inventive, as the cosmetics and personal care products that had been readily available before the war became scarce, simplified, or disappeared altogether. The raw materials needed to produce lipstick, face powder, perfume, nail polish, and skin cream, oils, waxes, pigments, alcohol, metals for packaging, were all in demand for other wartime purposes. Lipstick became harder to find, and the shades available narrowed to a handful of options, often in plain, undecorated tubes. Face powder came in fewer varieties. Perfume was a luxury that many shops simply no longer stocked. Women who had relied on these products adapted with remarkable creativity. Beetroot juice was used as a lip and cheek tint. Soot or boot polish, mixed carefully with a bit of petroleum jelly, served as a makeshift mascara. Cold cream, made at home from simple ingredients, replaced more elaborate moisturizers. Eyebrows were shaped with whatever pencil was at hand. But the most talked about shortage, the one that generated the most conversation and the most ingenuity, was stockings. Before the war, silk and then nylon stockings had been a standard part of most women's wardrobes. When nylon production was redirected almost entirely to military uses, parachutes in particular, stockings became one of the most desired and least obtainable items in the country. Fact Number 7. 2. Some women painted lines on the backs of their legs to imitate the seams of stockings when the real thing could not be found. And this small act of personal resourcefulness became one of the most iconic everyday images of the wartime home front. With nylon and silk stockings virtually impossible to buy, many women went bare-legged, which was considered somewhat informal by the social standards of the time. To create the appearance of wearing stockings, some women applied a tinted lotion or commercial leg makeup to give their skin an even, slightly darker tone. Then used an eyebrow pencil or a special seam drawing tool to draw a careful straight line up the back of each calf, imitating the seam that ran up the back of a real stocking. Getting the line straight was not easy, and many women enlisted a friend or family member to help, standing still while someone else drew the line with a steady hand. A crooked seam was noticeable and slightly embarrassing, and checking the straightness of one's painted seam became a small preoccupation. The whole practice was a little bit vain, a little bit practical, a little bit humorous, and entirely human. It was a refusal to let shortages have the final word on personal appearance, a tiny act of dignity and self-expression, carried out with nothing more than an eyebrow pencil and a bathroom mirror. Fact number 7. 3. Weddings during the war were often simpler than they would have been in peacetime. With limited fabric available for dresses, fewer luxury goods for celebrations, and all the practical complications that rationing and shortages imposed on even the happiest occasions. A bride might wear a borrowed dress, a tailored suit, a uniform, or a frock sewn from parachute silk if she was fortunate enough to come across some. The fabric coupons required for a traditional full-length white wedding gown were more than most people could spare from their annual allowance, so alternatives were the norm rather than the exception. Wedding cakes were often modest affairs. In Britain, where sugar, eggs, dried fruit, and butter were all rationed, the elaborate tiered cakes of peacetime were largely impossible. Some families displayed a decorated cardboard cover, made to look like an iced cake, over a much simpler sponge or fruit cake underneath. Flowers came from the garden rather than a florist. Food for the reception was assembled from the pooled rations of friends and relatives, each guest contributing a little butter, a little sugar, or a tin of something useful. Invitations were modest, decorations were handmade. Despite all of this, or perhaps, in some way, because of it, wartime weddings were celebrated with genuine warmth, real happiness, and a sincerity that more elaborate occasions did not always manage. Fact number 74. Cooking fat collection programs turned used household grease into an important industrial resource in some countries, connecting the kitchen stove to the factory floor in one of the war's more unusual recycling chains. Families were asked to save their used cooking fats, the drippings left over from roasting meat, the grease that collected in the bottom of a frying pan after cooking bacon, the oil left after deep frying, rather than throwing them away. The saved fat was poured into tin cans, allowed to cool and solidify, and then taken to a designated collection point, which in many neighborhoods was the local butcher's shed. The collected fats were processed at rendering plants, where glycerin was extracted. Fact number 75. School lessons sometimes included practical wartime topics like nutrition, conservation, and first aid, reflecting the broader expectation that every member of the community, even the youngest, had a useful role to play. Teachers across many countries wove the realities of rationing and shortages into their daily instruction. A lesson on nutrition might focus on how to plan balanced meals using the foods that were actually available under rationing, how to get enough vitamins from root vegetables and greens when fruit was scarce, or how to make the most of the protein in dried beans and lentils when meat was limited. Conservation lessons taught children to think about waste, why water should not be left running, why scraps of paper and metal should be saved, why food should never be thrown away if it could still be eaten. First aid was taught in age-appropriate ways, with children learning to bandage a cut, apply a cold compress, recognize signs of injury, and stay calm in an emergency. Some schools maintain their own victory gardens, where students learn to prepare soil, plant seeds, care for grown vegetables, and eventually harvest them for use in school meals. These additions to the curriculum were practical and grounded rather than dramatic. They reflected a wartime world in which the skills of everyday living, eating well, wasting little, and knowing what to do in a crisis, were considered just as important as arithmetic and spelling. Fact number 76. Many teenagers worked part-time or seasonally during the war to support farms and industries that were short of labor. And for a generation of young people, these jobs were often their first experience of real work and real wages. Older students might spend their summer holidays in the fields, helping with planting, weeding, thinning, and harvest. Others took on shifts in local shops, warehouses, or light manufacturing, filling gaps left by adults who had moved into heavier war production or military service. In agricultural areas, the extra help was desperately needed, as farms had lost much of their regular workforce to the armed forces and to urban factories. The work was often hard, early mornings, long hours, physical effort that left muscles aching and hands blistered. Calling hay bales, picking fruit in the heat, digging potatoes in the rain, none of it was easy, and it was a long way from the classroom. But for many teenagers, it was also their first paycheck, their first taste of responsibility, and their first experience of being treated as a useful contributor rather than a child. The sense of earning something real, of doing work that mattered, of being tired at the end of a day because something had actually been accomplished. These were powerful feelings for a young person. And the memories of those wartime summers stayed with many of them for the rest of their lives. Fact number 77. Agricultural labor shifted significantly as workers joined the military, and governments responded with programs that moved students, volunteers, and other new workers onto farms to keep food production going. The departure of young men from rural areas created labor shortages that directly threatened the ability to plant, tend, and harvest crops at the very time when domestic food production mattered more than ever. Governments organized a variety of responses. Volunteer harvesting programs recruited city dwellers to help during peak seasons. Schools arranged for older students to spend part of the year working on farms. In some countries, prisoners of war were assigned to agricultural work under supervision. Land that had not been cultivated in years was brought back into production, and every available pair of hands was put to use. The result was an unusual and sometimes surprising mixing of people who would not normally have crossed paths. A university student from London might find himself digging turnips alongside a retired farmer, and a teenager from a neighbouring village. An office clerk from Manchester might spend 3 weeks of the summer learning to drive a tractor and milk a cow. The wartime farm became a place where the ordinary boundaries of class, geography, age, and background were blurred by shared mud, shared meals, and shared exhaustion, and where people who had nothing in common except the work discovered that the work was enough. Fact number 78. In Britain, the Women's Land Army helped fill agricultural labor gaps by placing women on farms and in food production across the country, and the contribution of these women was essential to keeping the nation fed. Established at the beginning of the war, the Women's Land Army recruited tens of thousands of women, many of them from towns and cities with no previous experience of farming. They were given basic training and then assigned to farms, where they took on the full range of agricultural tasks, milking cows before dawn, ploughing fields behind heavy horses or early tractors, planting and harvesting crops, tending livestock, repairing fences, clearing ditches, and operating machinery. The work was physically demanding, carried out in all weathers and all seasons, often in remote and isolated locations, far from anything resembling urban life. For many of these women, known as land girls, the experience was transformative in ways they could not have predicted. Some found that they loved outdoor life and the physical labor. Others found it grueling and lonely. Most found it a mixture of both. The land girls wore a distinctive uniform, green jumper, brown breeches, and a wide-brimmed hat that became a recognizable symbol of women's wartime contribution to the countryside. Their work was not glamorous, and it did not always receive the recognition it deserved at the time, but it was vital. Fact number 79. In the United States, similar programs and migrant labor arrangements supported agricultural harvests under the intense demand of wartime food production. With millions of American men serving in the armed forces, farms faced the same fundamental problem as those in Britain: not enough hands to do the work when it needed to be done. The government responded with several approaches. The Bracero program, established through a bilateral agreement with Mexico, brought hundreds of thousands of Mexican workers to American farms over the course of the war, primarily to help with planting and harvesting in the western and southwestern states. Victory Farm volunteers, many of them students, teachers, and city workers with time available during the summer, were organized to help during peak agricultural seasons. Fact number 81. War bonds were promoted heavily during the conflict, turning the act of saving money into a public, visible, and communal routine. They gave ordinary people a direct and personal way to contribute financially to the war effort. Governments in the United States, Britain, Canada, Australia, and many other countries issued bonds that civilians could purchase at local post offices, banks, and other outlets. The principle was straightforward. A person bought a bond for a set price, and the government promised to pay it back at a later date with interest. The money raised went toward financing the enormous costs of the war. The campaigns to sell these bonds were extensive and creative. Posters, radio advertisements, newspaper columns, and public events all carried the message that every bond mattered, that even a small purchase made a difference. The language was simple and personal. This is something anyone can do. This is a way to help. This is money that will come back to the buyer someday with a little extra on top. War bonds made the abstract, almost incomprehensible financial scale of the war into something that fit inside a single person's budget. A teacher, a factory worker, a shopkeeper, a retired farmer, any of them could walk into a post office on a Tuesday afternoon, buy a bond, and walk out feeling that they had done something concrete and real. Fact number 81. Bond drives used posters, parades, radio spots, and workplace campaigns to promote sales, often with visible goals and community tagging, that turned the purchase of bonds into a shared, competitive, and sometimes festive public experience. In the United States, major national bond drives were organized as large-scale events, each with a specific fundraising target and a defined period. Towns and cities set their own local goals, and progress was tracked using thermometer-style displays erected in prominent public places. A tall wooden or painted board, marked with dollar amounts, with a rising red line showing how close the community was to reaching its target. Hitting the goal was celebrated publicly. Hollywood stars toured the country, appearing at bond rallies in town squares, theaters, and factory yards, drawing crowds and signing autographs for anyone who purchased a bond. Factories held internal competitions, with departments and shifts racing to see who could sell or buy the most bond. Schools ran their own smaller drives, with children buying 10-cent saving stamps and pasting them into booklets. Once the booklet was full, it could be exchanged for a bond. The drives had a social energy that went beyond their financial purpose. They were community events, opportunities for people to come together, see their neighbors, and participate in something collective and visible. Fact number 82. Neighborhood scrap drives and bond competitions made the war feel present and personal and everyday community life, turning the streets and blocks where people lived into small arenas of collective effort. Towns and neighborhoods organized competitions to see which street, which block, which school, or which civic group could collect the most scrap metal, paper, rubber, or other salvageable material. Results were tallied and announced in local newspapers, on community notice boards, and sometimes over the radio. A street that met its collection goal might earn a mention in the local paper or a small flag to display. Children went door to door, pulling wagons and asking neighbors for anything they could spare. Churches organized collection days. Scout troops and youth groups mounted their own campaigns, with leaders keeping careful track of what each member brought in. The competitive element, though friendly and light-hearted, added a spark of energy to activities that might otherwise have felt like routine chores. There was satisfaction in watching a neighborhood scrap pile grow on a vacant lot, knowing that every old pot, every bundle of newspapers, every flattened tin can represents something contributed by someone nearby. These local campaigns brought the war effort down to its most intimate and tangible scale. Not the factory, not the government office, but the front porch, the garden shed, and the house next door. Fact number 83. Hospitals and clinics adapted to wartime conditions by working with fewer supplies, fewer staff, and higher demand, and this changed how ordinary people experienced routine medical care in ways both large and small. Medical supplies, bandages, surgical instruments, certain drugs and medicines, rubber gloves, glass syringes, were often prioritized for military use, leaving civilian facilities to manage with reduced inventories. Many experienced doctors and nurses had joined the armed forces, creating gaps that were filled by less experienced staff, retired practitioners, or trainees still completing their education. The result was a medical system under strain. Waiting times for routine appointments grew longer. Some elective procedures were postponed or deferred. Dental work might be delayed. A prescription that would have been filled quickly before the war might now require waiting for a delivery of the necessary medicine. Rural areas, which had fewer doctors and hospitals even in peacetime, felt the pressure most acutely. People adapted as they adapted to everything else during the war, with patience, with lowered expectations, and with the understanding that the system was doing its best under difficult circumstances. A trip to the doctor or the local clinic was still possible, but it often came with longer waits, fewer options, and the quiet awareness that the medical world, like every other part of daily life, was stretched thin. Fact number 84. Penicillin production expanded dramatically during the war, and this expansion influenced how doctors treated infections and fundamentally changed medical outcomes for millions of people. The antibiotic had been discovered by Alexander Fleming in 1928, but for more than a decade afterward, producing it in useful quantities remained an enormous challenge. The mold that made penicillin grew slowly and yielded tiny amounts of the active substance. Fact number 85. Blood donation programs grew significantly during the war, and civilian participation in these programs became an important and deeply personal form of wartime medical support. Organized blood drives were held in communities across the United States, Britain, Canada, and other countries. Collection centers were set up in churches, school halls, civic buildings, community centers, and mobile units that traveled from town to town. Donors arrived, registered, rolled up their sleeves, and gave blood that would be processed, stored, and shipped to wherever it was most needed, military hospitals, field stations, and eventually civilian facilities as well. The American Red Cross coordinated one of the largest blood collection programs in history, gathering millions of pints over the course of the war and developing techniques for blood storage, separation, and transport that advanced the science of transfusion medicine. For many individual donors, the act of giving blood carried an emotional weight that went beyond its medical value. It was an offering from one's own body, a contribution that was as direct and personal as anything a civilian could give. There was no middleman, no abstraction, just a needle, a pint of blood, and the knowledge that somewhere someone might be alive because of it. The wartime expansion of blood banking and donation established the systems, the habits, and the public trust that became the foundation for civilian blood donation programs. Fact number 86. Disability and rehabilitation services expanded during and after the war, as societies confronted the reality that large numbers of people would need long-term care, support, and assistance in rebuilding their lives. The war produced injuries on an enormous scale: lost limbs, impaired sight and hearing, burns, nerve damage, and lasting psychological effects that would require years of treatment and adjustment. The demand for rehabilitation pushed medical and social services to develop new approaches. Advances were made in surgical techniques, in the design and fitting of prosthetic limbs, in physical therapy and occupational therapy, and in the understanding of how injured people could be helped to regain as much independence and function as possible. New hospitals, rehabilitation centers, and convalescent homes were established or expanded. Training programs were created to help people with disabilities learn new skills and find suitable employment. The war also changed how disability was perceived by the wider public. The visible presence of large numbers of injured people in communities across many countries made the human cost of conflict impossible to ignore and generated a broader sense of social obligation. The expansion of rehabilitation services was not a loud or celebrated part of the war story, but it was a profoundly important one, a recognition built into policy and practice that the duty of care did not end when the fighting stopped. Fact number 87. In the United States, many Japanese Americans were forcibly removed from their homes and incarcerated during the war, and this remains one of the most significant civil liberties violations of the era. In the months following the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, fear and suspicion directed at people of Japanese descent led to an executive order authorizing the forced relocation of over 120,000 people from the west coast of the United States. The vast majority of those affected were American citizens, born in the country, who had committed no crime and were under no individual suspicion. They were given only days to settle their affairs, to sell or store their belongings, close their businesses, and leave their homes. Families were transported to remote internment camps in the interior of the country, where they lived in basic, often harsh conditions, behind fences and under guard for much of the war. Children attended makeshift schools. Adults tried to maintain some sense of normal life under deeply abnormal circumstances. The incarceration resulted in the loss of homes, businesses, savings, community ties, and years of life that could never be recovered. In the decades that followed, the injustice was increasingly recognized. Formal apologies and reparations were eventually offered by the government. Travel between towns or regions might require a special pass. Gatherings could be restricted. The press was controlled. The common thread running through all of this was a life lived under a weight of external authority that reached into the most ordinary moments. Fact number 89. Resistance during the war sometimes took quiet, everyday forms: hidden printing presses, coded messages, sheltering people in need, or helping them travel safely, and these acts were often woven into the fabric of ordinary life, rather than carried out as separate dramatic operations. Not all resistance involved weapons or organized military-style actions. A baker might deliberately set aside extra bread and pass it quietly to a family that was hiding or in need. A clerk in a municipal office might alter a document, change a date, or misfile a record to protect someone from detection. A printer might lock the door of a basement workshop after the regular day's work was finished and spend the night producing an underground newspaper, a forged identity card, or a leaflet meant he slipped under doors before dawn. A farmer might allow someone to sleep in a barn or hide in an outbuilding. A train conductor might look the other way at the wrong moment, or give a quiet nod that told someone it was safe to move. Each of these acts was small in isolation, and each one carried real and serious risk. Discovery could mean imprisonment, deportation, or death. Yet these small acts persisted, sustained by a sense of shared humanity that occupation could suppress, constrain, and punish but could never eliminate. Quiet resistance was not the stuff of headlines. It was the stuff of backdoors, whispered words in steady hands. Fact number 90. In Germany and other countries, propaganda and state-organized youth programs tried to shape how young people spent their time and how they thought about duty, belonging, and their place in society. These programs structured the hours between school and bedtime with organized activities, sports, camping trips, group hikes, singing, physical fitness training, community service projects, and ideological instruction. Membership was often expected or effectively required, with social pressure and official encouragement, making it difficult for families to opt out. The programs were carefully designed to use the natural interests of young people, the desire for adventure, for friendship, for belonging to a group, for physical challenge and achievement, as vehicles for instilling particular values and loyalties. Within these organizations, genuine camaraderie existed. Friendships were formed, skills were learned, a sense of purpose was felt. But alongside the campfire songs and the hiking trips, there was a deliberate effort to shape thinking, to define what loyalty meant, and to channel youthful energy in directions that served the state. The experience of young people in these programs was complicated, a mixture of real enjoyment, genuine fellowship, social conformity, and ideological pressure that is not easily reduced to a single judgment. Fact number 91. Civilian diaries became an important personal record during the war, as people wrote privately about shortages, routines, worries, and the small details of daily existence that no official report would ever bother to capture. A diary offered something that letters could not, a space where honesty did not have to pass through a censor's hands, where complaints did not need to be softened for the sake of someone else's morale, and where the writer could say exactly what they felt without worrying about who might read it. A diary entry from a Tuesday evening might describe the frustration of queuing for 40 minutes, only to find that the shop had run out of what was wanted. A Wednesday entry might record the price of onions, the state of the weather, the sound of rain drumming on the roof of the Anderson shelter, or the particular quality of darkness on a blacked-out street. A Thursday entry might describe the relief of receiving a letter, or the worry that came when no letter arrived. Some diarists wrote every day without fail. Others wrote only when something felt worth recording, or when the need to put feelings into words became too strong to ignore. These private pages were conversations with oneself, carried out in the quiet of a bedroom or at the kitchen table after the rest of the household had gone to sleep. Fact number 92. Wartime diaries and letters are now key sources for historians studying ordinary life during the conflict, because they capture details, textures, and emotional truths that official records and government documents almost never contain. A government report might record that the meat ration was reduced by a certain number of ounces in a particular month. A diary entry from the same week might be a diary entry from the sigh of a cook opening the ration book, the conversation with the butcher, the meal that had to be refought because the expected amount was not there. Official records deal in policies, statistics, and decisions. Personal documents deal in what those policies meant at the kitchen table, in the school playground, at the factory gate, and in the quiet of a bedroom at the end of a long day. A single diary, kept faithfully in a kitchen drawer for decades and eventually donated to an archive, can illuminate the texture of an entire community's experience in ways that no official record ever could. Letters between separated family members reveal not just what people did, but how they felt about it. The loneliness, the humor, the worry, the tenderness, the small joys, and the grinding repetition Historians who work with these personal documents often describe them as the closest thing available to actually hearing the voices of ordinary people from the past. The diary that was written without any thought of being read by a stranger, and the letter that was meant only for the person whose name was on the envelope. These turn out to be among the most vivid, most truthful, and most important records of what daily life during the war was really like. Fact number 93. Workplaces during the war emphasized punctuality, safety, and output, and many people found themselves working longer hours than they had ever worked before, in conditions that demanded sustained concentration and physical endurance. Factories producing essential goods ran multiple shifts, sometimes operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Workers were urged to arrive on time, follow safety procedures precisely, maintain steady production rates, and minimize any interruption to the flow of work. Posters on factory walls carried messages about the importance of every minute, every product, every rivet, every weld. Absenteeism was discouraged through a combination of campaigns, peer pressure, and, in some cases, official penalties. Overtime was common, and in many workplaces, it was more or less expected rather than voluntary. Weekends off became unreliable. A factory worker might put in 10 or 12 hours on a shift, 6 days a week, for months on end. The pace was relentless, and the cumulative effect of sustained overwork was felt across the workforce. Tiredness became a background condition, something people carried with them constantly. By the time the war ended, many workers were not just weary but profoundly, deeply exhausted, worn down by years of effort that had left very little room for rest, recreation, or the ordinary rhythms of a balanced life. The wartime workplace got its production, but the human cost of that sustained output was paid in fatigue, stress, and the quiet erosion of personal time. Fact number 94. Labor disputes still happened during the war, though they were shaped by wartime laws, social expectations, and strong public pressure to keep production uninterrupted. Strikes and work stoppages did occur in several countries, typically over wages that had not kept pace with rising prices, over working conditions that had deteriorated under the pressure of round-the-clock production, or over disputes about hours, safety, and the treatment of workers by management. These disputes put workers in a difficult position. On one hand, their grievances were often legitimate. Long hours, inadequate pay, unsafe conditions, and the strain of sustained overwork were real problems. On the other hand, the social and political environment made it extremely difficult to take action. Governments argued that any disruption to production could cost lives and aid the enemy. Public opinion was often hostile to strikers, viewing them as putting personal interests ahead of the common good. In some countries, strikes in essential industries were formally restricted or outright banned by wartime legislation, with penalties for those who participated. Union leaders navigated a delicate balance, trying to represent their members' interests while staying within the boundaries of wartime acceptability. The result was a period in which labor relations were shaped by forces well beyond the usual negotiations between workers and employers. The wartime labor dispute was a reminder that even in moments of genuine national unity, the ordinary tensions of working life, questions of pay, fairness, safety, and dignity, did not simply evaporate because there was a war on. Fact number 95. Many consumer goods during the war used ersatz substitutes, materials designed to replace scarce natural resources, and these substitutes became a defining feature of everyday life in countries where imports were disrupted, and raw materials were redirected to military use. The word ersatz, borrowed from German, simply means substitute or replacement, and it was applied to an enormous range of products. Ersatz rubber, produced through chemical synthesis, replaced natural rubber from Southeast Asian plantations that were no longer accessible. Ersatz leather, made from processed paper or fabric, coated with synthetic materials, appeared in shoes, belts, and bags. Ersatz fabrics replaced wool and silk in clothing. Ersatz tobacco was blended from various dried leaves and herbs. Some of these substitutes worked reasonably well and became accepted parts of daily life. Others were clearly, sometimes painfully, inferior to the real thing, and everyone who used them knew it. The ersatz coffee smelled vaguely right, but tasted nothing like the genuine article. The ersatz shoes looked passable, but wore through in weeks. The ersatz fabric felt stiff and uncomfortable against the skin. Living with ersatz products was part of the daily texture of the war years, a constant, low-level reminder that the real thing was somewhere out of reach, replaced by something that was trying its best but not quite getting there. The word itself became a kind of shorthand for the entire experience of wartime making do. Fact number 96. Synthetic rubber expanded enormously in importance during the war, especially for tires and industrial applications, after a natural rubber supply was severely threatened by events in Southeast Asia. Before the war, the vast majority of the world's natural rubber came from plantations in Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and neighboring regions. When Japanese forces gained control of these areas in the early stages of the Pacific War, the supply of natural rubber to the Allied nations was effectively cut off, almost overnight. The loss was critical. Rubber was essential for tires, on military vehicles, aircraft, trucks, jeeps, and the millions of civilian cars and bicycles that kept economies moving. It was also needed for hoses, gaskets, seals, boots, and countless industrial components. The response, particularly in the United States, was a massive and rapid investment in synthetic rubber production. New chemical plants were built, new manufacturing processes were developed, tested, and scaled up. Scientists and engineers worked to create synthetic compounds that could match the properties of natural rubber closely enough to serve as reliable replacements. Within a few years, synthetic rubber production in the United States went from a small experimental output to an industrial torrent, producing enough material to meet a large share of wartime demand. Fact number 9. Home front life included a constant and quiet stream of small decisions about saving materials, from kitchen scraps to worn-out shoes, and these tiny daily choices, repeated millions of times across millions of households, formed one of the less visible but most persistent features of the wartime experience. Every day brought its own small moments of decision. Should a piece of string be saved or discarded? Should a paper bag be reused or thrown away? Should a pair of trousers be patched one more time, or finally cut up for cleaning rags? Should the last sliver of soap be pressed into a new bar, or rinsed away? A jar of bacon grease was saved and carried to the collection point. An envelope was turned inside out, readdressed, and sent again. A newspaper was read, folded, and added to the salvage pile rather than used to light the fire. The sole of a shoe was checked and rechecked before the decision was made to visit the cobbler yet again, or to try a homemade repair with a piece of old tire rubber. None of these individual decisions, taken alone, amounted to very much. A single saved piece of string made no measurable difference to anything. But collectively, across the millions of households that practiced these habits day after day, week after week, year after year, the cumulative effect was significant. Fact number 98. Austerity design influenced everyday objects during the war, favoring durability, practicality, and simple shapes over decoration, ornamentation, or visual flair. With raw materials limited and production capacity directed primarily toward essential wartime needs, the consumer goods that were produced for civilian use tended toward the plain and the functional. Furniture was built from available wood in straightforward, sturdy designs with minimal carving or decorative detail. Kitchenware, pots, pans, plates, cups, was made in basic shapes and limited colors, often without the painted patterns or glazed finishes that had been common before the war. Tools were simple and robust. Crockery was thick and unadorned. The driving principle behind austerity design was that no material should be wasted on anything that did not contribute to the object's purpose. A chair needed to support a person. It did not need to be carved or polished. A teapot needed to hold tea and pour it. It did not need a floral pattern or a gilded handle. The result was a generation of everyday objects that were honest in their simplicity and often surprisingly appealing in their plainness. There was a quiet kind of beauty in a well-made wartime chair or a simple ceramic mug. The beauty of something crafted carefully within very tight limits, where every line and every joint served a function. Fact number 99. The end of the war did not instantly end rationing, and in some countries, shortages actually grew worse in the months and years following the victory celebrations, before they eventually improved. The assumption that peace would quickly bring abundance turned out to be optimistic. In Britain, rationing on certain items became stricter after the war ended, not less so. The country was economically exhausted, deeply in debt, and struggling to rebuild its infrastructure, while also managing the transition of millions of people from military to civilian life. Global supply chains that had been disrupted by years of conflict took time to recover. Bread, which had not been rationed at any point during the war itself, was placed on the ration in 1946, a development that many people found both surprising and disheartening, as it seemed to represent a step backwards rather than forward. Meat rationing in Britain did not end until 1954, a full 9 years after VE Day. Sugar remained rationed until 1953. Other items came off the list gradually, one by one, over the course of nearly a decade. In other countries, the picture varied. Some recovered faster, others more slowly, but the general pattern held. The shift from wartime to peacetime was not a switch that flipped on a single day. Fact number 100. After 1945, millions of displaced people across Europe faced long and uncertain waits for housing, identity documents, and stable work. And the end of the fighting did not bring anything resembling an immediate return to normal life for these populations. The war had left cities in ruins, national borders redrawn, populations uprooted, and administrative systems shattered. People who had fled their homes during the conflict, who had been evacuated, deported, or forcibly relocated, now found themselves in unfamiliar places with no home to return to, or with homes that no longer existed, or with homes that were now on the other side of a new border. Refugee camps and temporary settlements housed hundreds of thousands of people, sometimes for months, sometimes for years. The process of establishing identity, proving who a person was, where they had come from, and what rights they held, was complicated by the destruction of records, the dissolution of governments, and the sheer scale of the displacement. Finding work was difficult in economies that were themselves rebuilding from the ground up. Housing was scarce in cities where entire neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble. For the millions of displaced people navigating this post-war landscape, the end of the war was not an ending in any meaningful personal sense. It was the beginning of a different kind of struggle. Quieter, less dramatic, but no less real. To find stability, security, and some kind of ordinary life in a world that had been profoundly. Fact number 101. Many everyday wartime habits, saving, repairing, careful shopping, stretching ingredients, and participating in community drives, left a lasting mark on post-war culture that persisted for decades, shaping the way an entire generation lived, consumed, and thought about material goods long after the specific shortages that had created those habits had faded. The person who had spent 6 years darning socks, patching elbows, saving string, reusing paper bags, and turning leftovers into tomorrow's meal did not suddenly stop doing these things the day the war ended. The habits were too deeply ingrained, too thoroughly practiced, too much a part of the daily rhythm to be shed overnight. Grandparents who saved pieces of wrapping paper, smoothed them flat, and folded them for reuse. Grandmothers who kept a tin of miscellaneous buttons, sorted by size and color, saved from garments that had long since been worn out. Grandfathers who could not throw away a piece of wire or a jar of screws because something, someday, might need fixing with exactly that. These were often people shaped by the war years, carrying forward habits that had once been necessities and had since become simply the way things were done. The instinct to waste nothing, to repair before replacing, to make something last as long as it possibly could. This was not nostalgia or eccentricity. It was the residue of an era that had taught, firmly and repeatedly, that nothing should be taken for granted. The ration books were eventually put away. The blackout curtains came down. The salvage drives ended. But something of the spirit behind all of it, careful, resourceful, community-minded, and quietly determined, persisted in the culture, like a garden that keeps producing long after the particular season that planted it has passed into memory. And so, the story of daily life during the Second World War comes, gently and quietly, to its close. Over the past 2 hours, 101 small facts have drifted past, each one a window into a world where the most ordinary things, a cup of tea, a pair of shoes, a letter from someone far away, a row of jars on a pantry shelf, carried a weight and a meaning that they do not usually carry. What stays, looking back across all these details, is not the hardship alone, though there was plenty of that. What stays is the steadiness, the mending, the queuing, the careful measuring, the gardens dug in backyards and public parks. The letters were written by lamplight at the end of a long day, the painted stocking seams, the cardboard wedding cakes, the dance socks, one more week. The saucepan were taken to the repair shop for the 3rd time. The string is saved in a kitchen drawer. None of these were grand acts. None of them made headlines. They were simply the quiet work of people getting through their days, one small decision at a time, in a world that was asking more of them than it ever had before. The kitchen is quiet now. The blackout curtain is drawn. The blackout curtain is drawn. The blackout curtain is all right. The ration book is back in the drawer, and somewhere outside, the world is still, calm, and at rest. Good night.